Welcome to today's virtual meetup. This session is being recorded on behalf of user group Singapore. If you do not consent to be part of the recorded sessions, please leave that call. This recording is available via YouTube channel live and after the sessions. We encourage you to use the chat window at any time to ask questions. The presenter will encourage you to speak to ask questions. With that, I let our host today, Nilesh.
Thanks, Ruth. I see some of the people who are connected and some familiar faces, but in case you're joining us for the first time, I'll put the links to our meetup page as well as our Facebook page. So we are part of the Microsoft user group community in Singapore. The Azure Singapore is just a small part of this, and we also have other communities like the Office, there is data community, AI, and the .NET community as well. So I've put the contact information of the people who are organizers of this Azure Singapore user group. In case you want to arrange any session, if you would like to request us, feel free to connect with us. If you would also like to present as part of our user group, you can also contact us on these email IDs. Now, there were a lot of sessions that we did over the last 6 months or so, and here are the latest 4 sessions. I'll put a short link here, which is bit.ly Azure Singapore sessions. You can watch the recording of all these sessions which we have done over the last 6 to 8 months. What's coming up next week is building distributed cloud native applications with Dapper, and over the last 3 or 4 sessions we have been doing a lot of things around Kubernetes, and this is another session which is related to building cloud native applications. It wasn't really planned, but it just happened that there were multiple speakers and multiple topics which were related to Kubernetes, and I think this goes along with the flow. Apart from our Singapore user group, our Azure Singapore user group, there is also next Wednesday a meetup hosted by the BizApps. So if you're interested in business applications and Office, you can attend this. Outside of the user group activities, there is also a very important event, which is the SQL Saturday. This is scheduled for next Saturday, and you can find the list of sessions here. I've also put a link, which is SQL Saturday 1019, and this is going all virtual this year. So a great opportunity for those who might not be able to attend in physical, but now since all the events are happening virtually, it would be a great advantage to attend this. Outside of these events, we have all the recordings of all our sessions on our YouTube channel. So I highly recommend that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. There is the QR code here, and you can find recordings of all our earlier events, not just the user group activities, but also events like the Azure Bootcamp and the Office 365 Bootcamp that happened. And here are some of the very famous sessions, or the ones which are chartbusters. Now, coming back to today's session, we have Sonia Cuff, who is a senior cloud operations advocate in Microsoft. She is joining us from Australia, and she'll be talking about managing security with Azure Defender and Azure Sentinel. She has over 2 decades of experience in managing the infrastructure and operations side of things. And the second session for today is about Kubernetes authorization with Scott Coulton. He is also a cloud developer advocate. And to be very frank, we didn't plan to have 2 people from Australia presenting on the same day. It wasn't planned as default, but it's a privilege to have 2 cloud developer advocates from the same country presenting on the same day. Now, in terms of what are the other related sessions to these topics, we had, as I said, a couple of topics around Kubernetes. So I put the links for our previous sessions. There was one which was done by Ranjit about automating deployments using Kubernetes, and our previous session was about monitoring the Azure Kubernetes service, or AKS clusters, by Kasun Rajapakse. So you can again go back and watch these sessions in case you are interested. Now, coming back to today's sessions, here are some of the reminders and housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself on mute during the session. If you have any questions, use the raise hand feature of MS Teams. And as Rivut said, this session is being recorded. If you find these sessions useful, please help us on social media by spreading a word about our user group and these sessions. With that, I would like to hand it over to Sonia. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you. I'll just Teams has been, well, I think it's land. Let's go. Okay, and while that's loading, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a little bit sad that I can't be there in person. Singapore has a very special place in my heart, having visited a couple of times for work, including the last Microsoft Ignite the tour. So I'm disappointed that I can't get on a plane and be with you in person. Understandably, the way that the world is right now, it's just great to see that you're carrying on with your virtual events and connecting with your communities anyway. So let's get started into managing security with Azure Defender and Azure Sentinel. And this talk came about because of some changes in our product names and the fact that security is a little word, but a very big topic. There's so many aspects to it. And I think we can get a little bit confused about where the different Microsoft products fit in all of the different security things that we have to manage. So tonight we'll have a look at a couple of things. We'll start off with what are the current trends that we're seeing in terms of cloud security threats. Then I'll tell you a couple of places that you can start to investigate and manage your security, and then leave you with a slide that is chock pack of aka.ms URL links for you to go and check out some more information if I've interested you in looking at it further. So let's start with today's security challenges. This information was provided as part of Microsoft's Digital Defense Report that was recently published, and it's a bunch of research that goes into analysing the trends that we've been seeing against our customer environments over the past year. I've put a link down the bottom of that slide. You can actually go and download a copy of that report if you want to have a read. But what we've been seeing is things like the most common nation-state attack types. So these are predominantly organised and sponsored by certain countries. They're looking at things like reconnaissance, harvesting credentials to then go and use them. Malware is still very popular, and exploiting VPNs. So these are the kinds of threats that we are seeing. We're also seeing an interesting shift from malware into phishing. So while malware is still quite prevalent in terms of injecting that thing into your organization that may encrypt your files and hold them to ransom, or just generally wreak havoc across your information systems, we are seeing a big increase in the amount of phishing attempts. And Microsoft security centers blocked 13 billion malicious and suspicious emails across 2019, and about 1 billion of those were directly attributed to phishing attempts. So this is where the bad guys try and convince a user that their ask is legitimate and that you should log into the website to verify that something's wrong. The interesting that we're seeing at the moment is sort of a shift in how they're doing that. Obviously, we had a bit of a rise with COVID-19 scams and getting people to try and hand over their user credentials that way. And now we're seeing more commonly the online shopping ones. And I've had a couple via SMS lately, the ones where your parcel has been delayed, you need to click here and verify it, or we can't deliver your parcel because there's an unpaid customs or tax or duty that you need to pay. And it's a really good way of these companies getting users to legitimately hand over a username and a password to a website that they would have. We're also seeing an increase in threats against IoT devices. In the first half of 2020, we saw a 35% increase in IoT attacks compared with the last half of 2019. Not quite sure why that is. Obviously, the world continues to evolve its technology and its use and its implementation of IoT devices. And I think the hackers are kind of waking up to that as being a very messy, potentially very unmanaged and unsecured entry point into people's environments that is easier for them to go and exploit than, say, some of the other secured places where we have infrastructure components. So that's been an interesting thing to see as well. So this is what, as an organization, you are battling, really. You've got all of these particular points where you may be exposed to attacks, whether it's a configuration that's not secure as it should be, a vulnerability in a system that hasn't been patched, open ports and entry points, exposed credentials, all of these different weaknesses in your environment that these attackers try and exploit. And then what that means is that they're then not only getting access through different parts of your environment, whether it's through a virtual machine attack or whether it's getting into an app or getting into somebody's credentials, all those IoT devices, but the next concern is where can they go from there? What does that lateral movement look like once they're in your environment? What other damage can they do and where can they go from there? So that's another concern we've got to watch out for. And then, of course, once they're in, what damage can they do? Are they deleting data? Are they copying data out of our organization and putting it on the dark web? Are they encrypting it and holding us to ransom? Or, are they even hiding in the background and not quite being so obvious, but spinning up things in our cloud and using up our compute resources to mine Bitcoin or something and us not even know about it? So there are a significant amount of things that hackers can do once they're inside your environment that I think go beyond the traditional what we tend to think of. We tend to think of things like viruses and ransomware and not maybe some of these other use cases, especially the ones where they get into your environment and they do take their time to execute their plans or to use your resources. And it can be a significant amount of time before an organization has actually detected that they've even been infiltrated and they've got those attempts against them. The challenge for most organizations these days is this is kind of what our environment looks like. And I joke that when I started in IT, security was so much easier because you had to come into the office and swipe your card and sit down at a computer that was controlled by the company and log in with your company password. And the only way you could access the data then was because you were connecting to a server in that organization. And that data was nowhere near the internet. It was protected by a firewall. You were really lucky if you had remote access, but that was very rare. And it just doesn't look like that these days. We expect to access systems and data that we need from wherever we are, from whichever device we choose. We're putting IoT sensors in smart vehicles and smart equipment. We're getting customers logging into systems, and we want our customers to be able to log in and to self-purchase with retail or do self-service things. And we may also be having partners and manufacturers and supply chains and all these other networks of people that we collaborate with. We want that connection where we can share information freely, and we may invite them into our space to collaborate on a project, for example. So finding out where those attack points are now is a little bit crazy because there are just so many more of them and not all of them are under our control. To simplify that a little bit, this is a slightly busy looking graph, but I'm going to break it down. In essence, what it says is those attack points, the areas where people can get into, fall into different sections. But at the top, I want to draw your attention to this stuff that's under the grey. So this is the hope. This is how we can help. And one of the most interesting things about that part of the graph is this band across here is the products and services that Microsoft offers that you can use and you can configure to help protect and improve your security. But this whole section here makes up the different components that Microsoft actually does on your behalf. So we run a cyber defense operations center. We have a malware protection center, a security response center, a digital crimes unit. We have cyber hunting teams, and we use our experts in alignment with industry partners, the networks that we've got with our antivirus vendors, and things like the certs advisories that come out about our security vulnerabilities. So just by using our products and services, you've got a pretty impressive security team working there for you on your behalf at no extra cost, because it's kind of in our best interest to protect our cloud environments, right? We don't want to breach as much as you don't want to breach. We have a lot of customer data at stake, and we take that trust and that responsibility pretty seriously. So seriously, in fact, that we invest a ton of money in it. So we're spending over $1 billion annually in our cybersecurity footprint with over 3,500 global security experts, and we literally analyze trillions of signals that come in to environments on an ongoing basis every year to filter out the noise, detect what really is bad, and keep improving our signals and our detections. So you don't have to quite do it all yourself. That's the good news. The challenging news is that we don't do it all for you. So you do have some responsibility to maintain the security of your environment. You've got devices to make sure that it's secured, identities and those credentials to make sure that people aren't giving out their passwords in silly places. You're monitoring access and you're making sure people don't have more access than they should have, and that any strange or unauthorized access attempts are dealt with. Your infrastructure is configured correctly. And when I say infrastructure, I mean both any physical hardware and networks and that you might have on premises, and any cloud infrastructure, whether it's in our cloud or somebody else's cloud that connects to the systems that you have from Microsoft. All of that needs to make sure that it is configured to best practices to be as secure as possible. And then, of course, you've got the configuration of the application itself. So is it in an insecure state because it's not being configured properly? And then what about the data? How are you handling if you're an organization that deals with classified information, for example, or how are you protecting so that people aren't emailing out credit card numbers or customer data and that kind of thing? So there are a significant number of touch points here that are your responsibility to look after and manage it. And we don't do that for you because they're your things to manage. That in essence is what this graph is telling us here. Those device footprints, again, whether they're company supplied or they're bring your own devices that your staff are using. Your identity, whether it's Azure Active Directory or Active Directory on-prem or some other identity system that you've got hooked into our applications. Your on-prem and your cloud infrastructure, and then, of course, your applications and data. So these are all the kinds of things that you need to manage, and those little icons across the top that start to show you some of the little capabilities, and the three little black dots, you can kind of expand that exponentially in terms of all the different capabilities to manage all those things. So already you can get a sense that there's a lot to do and there's a lot of capability to help manage it, but it still seems like a lot. So let's take a step back for a second and have a look at getting some of the foundations in place and understanding where some of the products fit and how they work together. The Microsoft story for security is very much one of integration, and we understand that you have all of these things to manage, even across all of the products and services that Microsoft provides that you might use, whether it's Outlook and Exchange Online with Office 365, whether it's those identities in Azure Active Directory, whether it's the virtual machines you've got in the cloud, or even your IoT stuff, your containers. All of those things need protecting. And so the way that we break it up is by looking at the security products for all of those things under a common umbrella name of Microsoft Defender. So Microsoft Defender is known as an extended detection and response system. Microsoft Defender is the products that will monitor those workloads and will tell you when there are security issues and attacks happening on those particular things. Azure Sentinel is our security incident and event management system. And Azure Sentinel is this great single pane of glass almost, where it will take the signals and events that are coming from Microsoft 365 Defender and Azure Defender, but even more. It will take signals from systems that you have in other clouds. It will take signals from other systems that you might use, and we'll go into Sentinel a little bit further on. But you can kind of see now that with Sentinel letting us do that investigation and that response, and then the Defender suite letting us control and monitor on individual workloads is kind of the picture and how it hangs together. Now, if you have been around security with Microsoft products before, I've just put up a bunch of little yellow post-it notes. The Defender products are not necessarily new products. It was a little bit of a rebrand because some of the naming was getting a little bit confusing. And this literally is things like Azure Advanced Threat Protection is now under this Microsoft 365 Defender suite. So is Microsoft Threat Protection, Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. So there's lots of sort of Defender or Threat Protection type names that we've gotten rid of, and they've all sort of been consolidated into this. Azure Defender for servers, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, used to be Azure Security Center Standard Edition. And Azure Security Center used to come in two flavors. So it came in Azure Security Center Free, which has a certain amount of capabilities for managing your resources in Azure, and then Azure Security Center Standard. And Standard was the upgrade. It was the next tier. It was the one you had to pay for that had more capabilities for different workloads. And that Azure Security Center Standard Edition you won't hear referred to anymore. That's now our Azure Defender for servers and some of the other Azure Defender capabilities. So that's the new way forward, and the dropping of some of those older names if you're more familiar with the products under those brandings. So Azure Security Center, this is really where most people start inside Azure. It is our cloud security posture management. And so it's going to give us visibility of whether or not the resources that we have inside our Azure cloud are configured the best way possible to be as secure as possible. Azure Security Center isn't so much going to detect an attack or a threat against one particular system, but it will tell us, for example, that we have some ports that are open or some storage accounts that haven't been secured, and give us recommendations to help us manage that. And it does that in a few different ways with things like Secure Score, enabling us to enforce policies and see if we're compliant with those, especially for our industry standards and regulations that we need to meet that are around security, and also some improved automation of what we can do if we get any alerts or recommendations in Azure Security Center. So let's stop presenting and take a look at Azure Security Center. I'm going to stop that and instead share my screen. Okay, so Azure Security Center has had a bit of an update in terms of its look and feel, and the dashboard has changed slightly. But with our Azure Security Center dashboard, and you can see this whether or not you're on the free tier or you've upgraded, we've got some nice easy things to see what the current state of our environment is. Now you can see that in this I've got 7 Azure subscriptions selected under my filters, and so the secure score that I've got is actually across all of those subscriptions put together. So this is really great if you're managing a very large environment and you just want to see how things are doing overall. You can dig into the details of individual subscriptions and individual areas, but this is a good start. This is our dashboard gauge on the car of how far we're going and how much more that we have to improve. And then we've got our regulatory compliance here. So this tells us how many controls we're compliant with across some of our industry standards. We've got insights that show us some of the more common recommendations that we need to update. And we've also got the controls with the highest potential increase. So if we want to go on a bit of a mission to improve our secure score, we might turn around and go, well, it's actually probably worth spending my time looking at remediating the vulnerabilities in here, because I'm going to get more benefit for that effort than, say, this one here where I only get a 5% shift. Now, obviously, it'd be great to do them all, but I understand with times and resources, you've got to prioritize and pick which one you're going to do first. So that's kind of a bit of an overview. We've got Azure Defender, we've got the inventory there, and I'll actually come in and show you that. We go into the inventory. Inventory shows us all of the resources that we are currently monitoring inside Azure Security Center. And we can see which ones are monitored, and we can see if there's any recommendations. So this particular virtual machine has 13 out of the 57 recommendations that are applied to it. The interesting thing about inventory is some of the things that we can do with it in terms of we've got filters up here. So if we don't particularly want to see VMs, we want to see different workloads, we can put some filters on there. We can export all of this into a CSV report, and we can also, if I click on a couple of resources just to bring it up, we can come in here and assign tags. So if you've used Azure Policy before and you're assigning tags to help with your compliance or to help identify where resources belong, which business unit is responsible for them, which cost management, which cost center they come under, for example, and you find they're not tagged, you can even just go and assign your tags in here as well. If we go and look at one particular virtual machine through the inventory, we can see for this virtual machine here, I've got 42 different recommendations, so that's quite a few, but it breaks it down for me into this low, medium, high again, so I can turn around and see which ones I should be doing. Here's all my recommendations of the ones that I need to go and do. So if I go and have a look, that one's per by a virtual machine, and yet I can go and have a look at the recommendations pane, and the recommendations pane will show me again that secure score and a list of it by recommendation. So say I decide that I want to go and look at this, remediate vulnerabilities. I don't want to go into every individual resource to find out and do it on an individual basis. So I can go and have a look at remediating these vulnerabilities, and I get a whole list of what those vulnerabilities are. And if I go and choose, let me have a look, which one shall I pick? Let's try this one. So it's telling me that vulnerability assessment findings on my SQL databases should be remediated, and it tells me which ones are actually unhealthy. Now, new and secure score. If I click on here, I don't have access in this particular demo to do this, but you can see it comes up and says create exemption. That's new and secure score, because sometimes you have a valid business case for not wanting to turn a particular setting onto a workload, and you may have mitigated that risk in some other way. You might have a third-party product that's mitigating that risk, for example, that isn't being detected in here. So now you can actually exempt individual resources from those security findings so that they're not going to keep dragging down your secure score number, because you know that they're sorted and then they're not negatively affecting that number that you're trying to update. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to show you in Security Center itself is workflow automation. So one of the things you can do with Security Center is actually add in some workflow automations, because who sits around watching a dashboard all day, right? If we're getting recommendations or alerts in Azure Security Center, maybe we want to do something with them to give us benefit visibility of them. So I'm going to choose in a trigger detection to say if I get Security Center recommendations, and I can choose maybe I only want to see the higher ones, I can actually create a logic app. And the logic app can do whatever I want it to do. So the logic app might post a message inside a Teams channel. It might create a ticket inside my ticketing system. There are a number of things that we can do, obviously, with logic apps to kind of automate this stuff from Azure Security Center. Okay, let me just jump back to my PowerPoint. I just realized it's not going to remember which slide I was on. I should have remembered which number it was, sorry. Trick for next time. Okay, 15. So as I mentioned, asset management, that was an inventory thing that I showed you where you can have a look at it by resource. You can do your filtering, you can do your tagging, you can export it to CSV, you can take all this information and start exploring it in resource graph. There are a significant number of things you can do to get really good visibility of what resources you're actually monitoring. And then that exemption that I mentioned about exempting things from secure score. So when you've got an exception that as a valid exception that you don't want to be tracked in there anymore. And then not only can you integrate with Azure Logic apps, but you can adjust secure score with your custom policies. You can create custom policies and import them from GitHub, and you can hook into a number of other systems via Logic apps, whether you're using different ITSM solutions, for example. Right, so that's Azure Security Center. Where does Azure Defender fit in? I mentioned that Azure Defender was a threat protection capability for your specific workloads. Now, not all of the workloads inside Azure are currently supported. Here's a list of what we have generally available at the moment, including our virtual machines, our virtual machine scale sets, Azure Kubernetes service. There's a few there already, Key Vault as well. And then we do have some new services coming on board in public preview, like SQL Server and IoT devices, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm on slide 20. Remember slide 20, people. Let's go and bring up Azure Defender. Okay. So Azure Defender looks a little bit like Security Center at first glance. And if you have a look, we have a Azure Defender dashboard inside Security Center itself. So with Azure Defender, we can see which of our resources are covered. We can upgrade workloads to Azure Defender, which was the same as enrolling them in this Azure Security Center Standard Edition. We can see which ones are being covered or not. We can take a look at the security alerts and see what's going on with these. And then we can have a look and see, again, which ones of these are unprotected. Now, there was another sorry, I'm having a little... And again, this shows us ones that are unhealthy. I'm missing a step. Maybe it was my Andy. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm just trying to, there was one other step that was showing here earlier that's not. This is always the way with demo environments, isn't it? And I don't think it comes. Let's take a look and see. No, it's not going to show it there. Okay, well, let's go back to our slides. So I'm just looking at a question in the chat while I get to the right slide again. Can I advise how to use an exemption in Azure Security Center to be applied for many resources? Can we have a blanket exemption rather than adding on each unhealthy resource? That's a good question. I actually haven't looked at that at scale, but I can see a potential use case for it. I'm trying to remember whether or not you can actually do an exemption, say maybe by a resource group. Let me know in the chat whether or not it's a case of you have resources that may be in a certain location, like they're all in the same resource group that you want to exempt, or whether or not they are resources that may be all of the same type. Because that will change how it's structured, and there may be a command line way to do it. So yeah, I'll investigate that one and get back to you. Okay, so what can Azure Defender do when you dig into the particular workloads? We've got a look at Azure Defender for container registries. So there was an update to Azure Defender for container registries where it's actually doing image scan in runtime. So it's continuously scanning recently pulled images to see if there's any vulnerabilities in those container images. That's fairly new. Azure Defender for Kubernetes, I understand you've been doing Kubernetes stuff quite a lot recently. So absolutely, with Azure Defender for Kubernetes, we've got things like hardening and auditing those AKS clusters according to our Azure security benchmarks, runtime threat detection, so actually detecting specific behavior that's suspicious inside those Kubernetes workloads. And what is new is admission control policy management, so mandating and auditing the security best practices on those Kubernetes workloads. So this is the way of pulling together something that is obviously very workload specific inside Azure Defender for Kubernetes, looking at these workloads and the specific security needs that your Kubernetes environments have, but by being able to feed that information back into Azure Security Center. We've also put together this Kubernetes attack matrix. So they did a bunch of research in terms of what are the most common attacks that we see against these kind of workloads as well, and came up with a list of the kinds of things that we're looking at. And there's a really good blog post there that explains it. So if you're interested more in securing these Kubernetes workloads, go and have a look at that attack matrix. And IoT I mentioned, so Azure Defender for IoT. We have acquired a company which now gives us an agentless way of detecting and managing IoT devices on your network. So instead of having to deploy an agent onto a device because you know the device exists, this works on one of the ports inside your environment. It's a little network box and it attaches to your networks, and it will actually go out and automatically detect if there are any IoT devices. With Azure Defender for IoT, it's going to tell you when there is a vulnerability or an exploit that is published for that particular device. It may be an alert that you need to update some firmware, for example, when there's open ports, unauthorized internet connections, and it uses our machine learning and our IoT aware behavioral analytics to do some detection and some advanced analytics on those threats. And now that stuff also integrates with Azure Sentinel, and we'll go and take a look at Azure Sentinel soon. That shows you how things fit together inside the Azure Sentinel world. That's just an example of having a look at this asset discovery and the network topology mapping, showing you where those devices are, and a vulnerability management example that's come up in a security alert on this particular Honeywell device to tell you that the firmware version has changed. That might not seem weird, but it might be. There might be some reason that someone's gone and applied a different version of firmware that you weren't ready to test yet, or it is a little bit out of the ordinary because it's actually suspicious. Someone's gone and done something on that device to that firmware to allow them to get an environmental vulnerability. And now Azure Defender for SQL has detection for unusual and harmful attempts to breach those SQL servers, whether or not they're in Azure, they're on-prem, or they're in another cloud. We've got vulnerability assessments, but we've now got these SQL servers with Azure Arc enabled SQL servers. So Azure Arc is a key piece of technology for us that helps us deploy these kind of Azure products and services into machines that don't live in Azure. So virtual machines, for example, that aren't in the cloud, we now can have visibility of them just like they are in Azure VMs, so that we can control them and manage them and have them as part of one system and one environment, rather than having to do management in different ways when our resources are in different places. With Azure Defender for servers, this is similar to the Azure Defender for SQL servers in terms of Azure Arc providing this functionality to give us this multi-cloud and this hybrid protection, bringing all of our resources into Azure Security Center no matter where they are. And they can be on Google Cloud, and they can be in AWS, and they can be on-prem, and they'll still be counted towards your secure score. They'll still be managed by Azure Defender for threat protection, and we can still integrate them with Azure Sentinel, do some automation, and apply policies and controls to them. That's a little bit of what the dashboard looks like with our multi-cloud visibility. You can see by this picture, we've got 219 AWS accounts and 43 GCP projects, and it actually talks into the management planes of those systems in terms of picking up the assessments and the vulnerabilities from those cloud platforms too. Azure Defender can be deployed anywhere with Azure Arc, so it's pretty easy to go and deploy and to get those resources in to Azure Resource Manager so that we've got control and visibility of them. Now, Azure Sentinel, last but not least, Azure Sentinel is our end-to-end solution for security operations. I'm going to leave the demo to the end, so I don't need to stop this slide deck and come back to it, but basically what it is our security incident and event management system. It helps us see where the potential breaches and attacks are across all of our workloads. And the cool thing about it is that it can link those together. So there are a few different things that you do in sort of a security role. We need visibility of collecting and seeing those signals, and more importantly, making sure we're not going to get overwhelmed by everything that's going on, especially if there are some false positives in there. Detecting what does look suspicious through our analytics or going on a bit of a hunt. It's really good detective work to go investigating different things that are happening in your environment, and then being able to log something as an incident, manage that incident, and even build in some automation in terms of the response. So we've talked about collecting that security data, as well as all the different Microsoft products and services. We can use AWS, other cloud apps, SaaS applications. There are a significant number of data sources that Azure Sentinel will take information from, and then it's about applying the rules and the machine learning to go and have a look at those. And again, your on-premises resource, so even things like your Cisco and your Palo Alto firewalls. With workbooks inside Azure Sentinel, we can create our own workbooks. We can customize workbooks that are already there, and we can really start to build up a visual picture of what's important to us and to our organization, and gain some more insights into this data, so we're not just presented with a flood of text anymore. And those interactive dashboards makes it easy for us to get that information and start drilling down into different aspects of the things that we're seeing there too. With analytics to detect threats, we can choose from more than 100 built-in analytics rules. So you can now start to build the picture of what is strange for your organization and what are the kinds of things that you want to monitor, customize and create those own rules using custom query language, and then correlate your events with your threat intelligence and with Microsoft's URL intelligence as well. And there's something really cool with the URL detonation, where it will go and check what's behind a URL and present a screenshot and maybe what the ultimate destination was for that suspicious URL inside the incident and the threat detection report that we're looking at. And then we can trigger some automated playbooks if we want to automatically shut down some systems, or if we want to fire off some ticketing and alerting in another system. With machine learning, this is already built in with our models to detect anomalies and do a whole bunch of security stuff. But coming soon, you can also bring your own machine learning models if you've got power in the security stuff that you're already doing and you want to build that into the engine of the platform as well. And track the incident. So this is really, really cool, being able to go into an incident and tracking an investigation, seeing which ones look worse than others and are obviously a more higher priority. Collect things that are related together in this one area, assign and track people to be responsible for them, tag and comment them, and integrate all of this with your ticketing system. So now we're pulling together all these different signals of information into an incident inside Azure Sentinel. But if you are doing things like keeping a log of who's done what where in terms of hunting and remediating this particular attack, you can also make sure that that all feeds back into whatever ticketing system you use, so you're not having to update it in 2 different places. This one is also great about being able to visualize the entire attack. So it's about giving you that picture of, well, we might have detected it on a log here in a particular workload, but what we don't realize is that it spread through here and there was this other log on this other firewall somewhere that's actually related to that incident. And without going through silos of individual logs or individual monitoring systems for different workloads, this helps pull together this map of data of this thing happened here and this thing happened here, and they're actually potentially related to the one security incident. So you can navigate through that relationship, expand the scope, look at your timelines, and get some insights into sort of related entities and more. And with the automated detonation, that's the one that I mentioned earlier. I love this one about being able to configure the URL entities in the analytics rules and automatically trigger the URL detonation. So come back and you can see on that screenshot, it's actually given me what the suspicious URL was, what the website, it doesn't look like that dodgy a website to me. It must have been a phishing attempt, that it looks like a Microsoft sign-in page. And then ultimately what the destination URL really was, if they've got a redirect or something strange in the background as well. We can go hunting through our security data. So maybe it's not necessarily triggered an alert, it doesn't look like a big event, but we can do some threat hunting queries to go and troll through the data and have a look at what's happening inside our environment with our hunting and our investigations, and then explore our data sets with free text or fields, tabulate, use all the power of KQL, visualize those query reports, and detect and plot the anomalies in your data. So this is giving security professionals who are really good at doing this stuff just out of, you know, the raw talent of knowing how all of this stuff works, and not locking them into a product that is going to automate too much for them. They still want the freedom to be able to go and hunt and detect and plot and look at the data in a way that follows how they work to best use their talents. And then with bookmarks, we can bookmark data that looks a little strange if we want to check it from later, maybe start an investigation of that and monitor a live stream of threat-related activity. What's going on right now that might be relevant? Jupyter notebooks for advanced hunting, so they run in our cloud. You can save them, you can query them, you can bring in your external data sources, again, giving the tools for our security professionals to go and use all of this great capability. And then we can automate and orchestrate our security operations, again, using Azure Logic apps. So build and automate your playbooks, choose from a library of samples, use the built-in connectors and create your own, and trigger playbooks from alerts or incidents. And then here's an example of some of the playbooks. So whether it's incident management for things like assigning a ticket, whether it's automatically looking up a geo for an IP address, or whether there's automated remediation like blocking a suspicious IP address from connecting, or blocking a user account, for example, triggering conditional access on an account, or completely isolating a machine if we think a machine is under attack. All of those things that can be automated to kick in before the humans have had a chance to even see and look at and detect the alert, we can start to minimize the damage that that attack might be having before our security people even get a chance to look at it. I'm going to bring you up the resources, and then I'm very conscious of time, so I will show you a quick demo of what Azure Sentinel looks like. Some of the things that I mentioned today in terms of Azure Defender are generally available, and some of them still are in public preview. So just remember that if you want to go and play with your production workloads, those public preview services don't necessarily come with a full production service level agreement in terms of availability right now, and they are subject to change. However, we love our customers using our public preview products. It gives us a wealth of information on what you want to see changed in the products before we make them generally available. And it's certainly worth looking at it in like your test and your demo environments, especially if you want to go looking at things like the Kubernetes, which is in public preview at the moment. Here are the resources, and I will come back to the resources after a quick Sentinel demo. Quite quickly, there is the product page for Azure Defender. There is the Azure Security blog on Tech Community, and again, Azure Sentinel, the product page, and the Azure Sentinel blog that exists in Tech Community. I've put together a collection of resources on Microsoft Learn. So at aka.ms/mslearnaz security, you'll get a collection of modules and learning paths about things like Azure Security Center and some of the things I've talked about today. I don't quite think the Sentinel stuff is in there yet. It's pretty new, but I'll keep updating that collection as the new security stuff comes through. There's two really interesting blogs that my team have put out lately. The IT Ops AZ Security Top 10, which was the top 10 recommended best practices for security on Azure. And also the IT Ops Sec name changes is a great little article that Sarah wrote about the slide where I showed you the old product names and what those new product names are. So if that's still confusing you a little bit, or if you hear an older product mentioned, that's a great blog to bookmark for future use. And then some contact details for some people. So I'm Sonia Cuff. You can find me at Sonia Cuff on Twitter, and I've also put my LinkedIn profile there, but you may not know the other two. So Sarah Young is one of our security experts. She is on the Azure Sentinel team now, and she's just amazing. She is the expert on Azure Sentinel if you're interested in learning more. And Mark Anderson is a more local resource here in Australia that you might not have heard of. Mark is the National Security Officer for Microsoft Australia. It's his day job to protect Microsoft Australia from security threats. And he's pretty good at his job, and he often talks to our customers and publishes great information on his LinkedIn profile. So go and follow Mark Anderson on LinkedIn, and some of the articles that he publishes are really, really interesting from a security perspective. Okay, let me do a quick Azure Sentinel demo. Okay, so for Azure Sentinel, we've got a whole bunch of events and alerts over time here. So you can see there's been quite a few of them, obviously, on this page. We can see recent incidents and the different severities. We've got some data sources that are showing some strange things. So our DNS events have spiked a couple of times here, and our Office activity has spiked as well. And we've got a nice little graph showing us where there has been some potential malicious events. Now that's defaulting to the last 24 hours. I can change that. It's just going to update the dashboard for me. But this is starting to get into what's really happening inside my environment. If I go and take a look at an incident, the last 30 days, there is again a whole bunch of incidents here, and I can go and select one. Hey, there's a hack tool that's been detected. Yeah, that's not great. So I can click on this and I can see some of the information about what has actually happened with this person, with this event, an anomalous sign-in activity that might be slightly strange. Let's go and see. Have we got anything on containers? No, we don't. That's not helpful. Okay, so excessive Windows login failures. This is a good one. If we go and click on excessive Windows login failures, it'll actually show me that this user has over 50 Windows login failures today, and at least 33 of the count of the login failures over the previous days. So something's not quite right here. This is not just your average user forgetting their password because they've just come back from holiday. So I haven't needed to go, I haven't gone into Azure Active Directory, I haven't gone into Windows Server, I haven't gone into the local computer. It's pulling that signal in to Azure Sentinel for me to go and take a look. And if I scroll down a little bit more and I catch, trying to make my toolbar go away, catch the button to investigate it, this is where I start to build up that threat hunting map, and I can actually go in and I can see what these related entities were. So it's going to show me the different accounts, user accounts on this machine that may have also been impacted with that as well. So that's just a very quick look of what those incidents look like, and the fact that you can then go and dig into them. And our playbooks is where we have all that different automation, and we can go and set up these logic apps and the automation that I talked about as well. And that's kind of Azure Sentinel in a nutshell. You can go hunting through the things and have a look at the notebooks. But yeah, this is this one place to see all of those threats and those incidents, maybe from all of the different connections. Let's just go into data connectors so I can show you exactly how much there are there. If I go and click in and have a look at the providers, it'll show me all of these different Barracuda, Checkpoint, Cisco, Citrix, F5 Networks, all of these other companies that are providing information that will integrate into the SIEM, so we can really build this great picture of our entire environment, not just the things that we have from Microsoft, which is a good thing. And that is it for the end of my presentation. While we just, I don't think we need that resources slide up anymore. I'll leave it there. If there's any questions in the chat, we have a few minutes. I'm just catching up on that one. Is there a way to define notification when it finds high vulnerability in ACR? I'm pretty sure there is. So you can set which alerts and which levels and which particular areas, and then turn on the right automation that you want to be notified. So that should be a fairly easy thing to set up. Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
Sonia, one question. Could you put the relationship between Sentinel, Defender, Threat Center, which interacts with what is a parent, child, whatever, and which of those resources are free and which one needs to premium Pure or P2 subscription? Thank you.
Yeah, good point. So the way that I think about it is Azure Security Center is going to tell you how secure your configuration is of your resources. Now, it's going to do that at a certain level for the Azure Security Center free edition, but there are more features and capabilities that you get by onboarding those specific workloads into what is now Azure Defender. So Azure Defender for IoT, Azure Defender for servers, and a lot of it is around the management and the automation when it finds and tells you that those vulnerabilities are a thing, that your configuration isn't quite right. With Azure Sentinel is the thing where it is all based on events. So it is the thing that is doing the monitoring, and it is looking at logs, and it's looking at suspicious behavior, and it is going to tell you when it thinks that an incident or an event has happened on those resources. So it doesn't care if you have an RDP port open. Sentinel is the thing that's going to tell you if someone's trying to do an attack against that RDP port. But the cool thing about Azure Sentinel, as I mentioned, is while Azure Security Center will do our Azure workloads, and it will do some workloads that aren't inside Azure, like Windows Server, like Azure SQL and IoT, Azure Sentinel is the thing that is going to read in the logs and bring you in signals from all of those other hardware appliances and other systems that you have. It's not going to tell you whether they're configured properly, but it's going to tell you if somebody's hacking them. Azure Sentinel pricing, I knew somebody was going to ask me that. Yes, Azure Sentinel pricing is based on the amount of data that's ingested. I'm actually just going to put a quick link in the chat. Azure Sentinel pricing is based on how much data you're putting into Azure Sentinel at the time. So obviously it's going to be a little bit different if you're a small environment versus if you're one that's really big and you're putting a significant amount through. But it's not, well, I guess it depends. It literally just depends on how much data you're putting through into it. But I will put the link to the Azure Sentinel pricing in there. The other pricing for the other products you can just get from the product pages. So the aka.ms/Azure Defender. I think was one of them, and you can just get pricing from those pages.
I had a question, Sonia, around the notebooks. So it's great to see notebook capabilities being integrated into the environment. Where does it run in terms of compute? Because Jupyter notebooks, we need some sort of compute to run them, right? So is there any additional cost in terms of writing our own, let's say, queries or things around Jupyter notebook? And if you want to make some advanced sort of queries against the data that's available?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there is. Let me have a look. Because Azure Sentinel in essence is a lot. Let me see. Azure Sentinel in essence is a Azure Log Analytics workspace. And it's got to do with retention periods. So the way that it works is that Azure Sentinel ingests data and holds it at no cost for the first 90 days. Now, if you have any need to change that, then there would be a charge as per the standard log analytics retention prices. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about security threats, if it's more than 90 days old, it's probably not really relevant anymore anyway. And I'm pretty sure that the notebooks are actually counted in that log analytics pricing, which means that there is no charge for the first 90 days. But I can check that too. Pricing is just one of those fun arts. It really is.
Okay.
Let me have a look. And I've got another question. Does Azure Sentinel provide connectors to other cloud providers to monitor the security events? I believe it does, but I believe it's not so much a connector to another cloud. It's a connector to a workload in another cloud. So, for example, if you were wanting to monitor security attacks against a virtual machine that's in AWS, you'd use Azure Defender for servers, and Azure Defender for servers because it has the connection into that resource inside AWS. And Azure Defender for servers surfaces that inside Azure Sentinel, if you know what I mean, if that makes sense. So you can't just connect to AWS, you have to connect to a particular resource, and that connection is done via Azure Defender. Cool, hope that helps.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Sonia, for this wonderful session and the demo. Would you be able to share the slides for the audience to refer?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send you a link and you can publish them.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for this. So I see Scott is all ready for his session. So without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to Scott, who is going to talk about the Kubernetes authorization. Over to you, Scott.
Hi, how's it going?
Good so far.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Why won't it let me share my screen? There it is. Okay, can you see the slides?
It's coming up. Not yet. Do you want to try resharing it again?
Yeah, retry again. It's on, yep, one sec. See, I'm using Windows. If I'd have used my Linux computer, it probably would have worked, but I thought this would have worked better on. Here you go, I'll just share the browser. Yeah, you can see that now.
Yep.
Okay, cool. It was like not sharing just the PowerPoint. Cool. Okay, cool. So I'm Scott Coulton. I work for Microsoft, as does Sonia. I'm a principal cloud advocate, and I'm also the lead for containers. So anything to do with DevRel and containers runs through my team. And we've got people all over the place. There's like myself in Australia, there's a gentleman in Brazil, and we've got another new hire coming soon, which is pretty exciting. So a little bit about me. I'm not going to talk much about myself, but I've spent a long time on container stuff, probably 5 years now. So if you look at Docker, it's 6 years old, so I was there pretty early on. I write most of my stuff in Golang, although I consider myself not really a developer, more of a sysadmin, but I like to tinker around with Linux stuff. And I'm a Docker captain and a CNCF ambassador. And as you know now, KubeCon's on right now. Well, not literally right now, but it was on this morning and is on again tomorrow morning. And I am the track chair for runtimes in KubeCon with Craig Peters, who's also from Microsoft. So that's pretty exciting. So this is what we're going to talk about today. It's Kubernetes authorization. I'm actually not going to talk about anything to do with like AKS. This is upstream Kubernetes. So this will be relevant no matter what cloud you use or installation of Kubernetes. I wasn't quite sure on how deep we should get into authorization. So this is kind of the 101 of authorization. So we're going to go through the concepts used and then break down those concepts, what they mean, and also how that ties to you if you're a developer or if you've got an application that you're deploying, how do you get authorization to work for stuff like secrets or anything else that you need to talk to through the Kube API. So the concepts used, there's actually more concepts than this, but I'm going to go through the most common ones. Again, I'm not, it's really hard to judge while I'm sitting here in my office in Australia how in-depth in authorization you would like me to go. If this is too basic, I definitely can come back and do another one and go like a really deep dive into authorization in Kubernetes, like level 400 talk. This one's just going to be kind of a bit more of a talk for everyone. So if you have never done authorization before on Kubernetes, you'll learn the basics here, and then we can move on from there in the future. But the three major ones that you'll use, and as I said, there is more. There's like ABAC, but the major ones are Node, which handles the node and any of the hardware on it. You've got RBAC and you've got Webhook, and we'll go through the differences between those on what RBAC's used for and what Webhooks can be used for. So Node, as I mentioned, pretty much is authorization that grants permissions from Kubelet to talk to the pods where they can schedule on. So it's basically looking after the node itself. When you're building an application, you probably don't need to know that you don't really need to worry about this in your application, but it's good to know from a scheduling point of view where your pods are running in that application. Sorry, I skipped ahead one. So yeah, so when you think about when the kubelet runs and the kubelet starts bootstrapping things and starts talking these things across your cluster, the authorization of Node is granted. Is an authorization model. The authorization model also breaks down into when you want to do things like node taints, or you might want to not run two workloads together. That's kind of using the node authorization as well through RBAC or something similar. RBAC is like it is on everything as role-based access control, and that is probably where you'll spend the most time if you're deploying your application onto Kubernetes and you want to start looking at authorization and security and what can look at each other. For example, you might have a secret, which might be a password to a third-party service like Azure SQL. And application A needs to talk to the database, but you might also have an API server running there. You don't want the API server getting the SQL backend database password. So you can start doing authorization models around what can talk to what, and that itself in Kubernetes upstream isn't as advanced as it probably needs to be. But then there is a lot of exciting projects at the moment, like Open Policy Agent, which we're implementing some of the stuff in Open Policy Agent on Azure Sentinel, I believe. But if you have a look at the Open Policy, the Azure Policy Manager on Azure, it's actually based off Open Policy Agent, which we'll talk about a little bit later and get into where that all fits into the authorization. And when you start to build your application out on, and you need to have real fine-grained control over what talks to what can talk to what and such on. Oh, ABAC, I took that out because it got a little bit confusing, so I'll just skip that one quickly. And a webhook is a callback to a third-party service, and that will actually introduce something into Kubernetes itself to check authorization. Now, when you think of a third-party service, that just means it's not natively part of Kubernetes. It can actually be running on the cluster. So it's not something that has to always be external of the cluster. It's just external of the Kubernetes API and the authorization model within. So that could be something like an LDAP service or anything else that you want to bolt into to define users or something and things like that. So if, an example on Azure would be our pod identity when you use the MSI service. So it's basically getting an AD token and saying you're allowed to talk to another resource within Azure. That would be classed as a third-party authorization service because it's not part of upstream Kubernetes itself. It's something external, but it is most likely running on the cluster. So I just wanted to clear that up. It doesn't have to be, like when it's a third party, it doesn't have to be external. So this is kind of like what it looks like when an API call is made. So this is like.
Yes, Scott, nothing is visible. Could you make it bigger?
This one, I cannot. I tried to make that as big as possible.
Okay.
I'll when I make the slides available, I'll put the reference to the actual. This is actually from the Kubernetes documentation. I'll put the actual reference in there. But basically, what this is doing is if a user does like kubectl get pods, which is a fairly simple command that everyone would run, there's actually a whole heap of authorization that goes through. So the user will check, kubectl will check with the kube API to make sure that they have the right token, and back and forth. I'll skip over this a little bit because if it's too small. But basically what it's saying is kubectl will check the API server. It will see if the signature is valid. If so, and authorized, it will be able to return the result that the user has. So it's a pretty standard workflow for authorization. So this is what when I spoke a little bit about before. This is what the node is broken into, and this is what the node authorization allows kubelet to perform API operations on. So you can see that it's the services, endpoints, nodes, pods, and volume claims, and also anything that's bound to the kubelet's node. So you would, if you write an application, and for example, it's a Redis cache and it needs some sort of disk to write to, then you're granting access to that disk, the disk mount inside the pod, or a Kubernetes volume, that would actually be talking into the node authorization. The node authorization would then create the disk share, and then that would mount it to the pod. And that when you're talking about the node authorization, it's talking about that sort of being able to do that. So, for example, if a user in your environment was trying to create that Redis cache and with the disk volume, and they didn't have permission to create that on in their kubectl config. What would happen is you would actually go through different authorization steps when Kube API checks to see if it does have access. It would be the node authorizer that would block it because that person doesn't have access to talk to create API for volumes. So this is the right administration. So when you start looking at this is, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, this is about node restriction and the emission pub plugin. So this is, does this user have access to go to this particular node, or does this application, depending on how you've written up the YAML file for the deployment, hopefully you're not using the cluster admin for everyone, and you've got roles and accesses set up properly. So this is the simple write operations. So this is where the node authorization is not super important if you're creating your own applications. But auth-related operation is like the certificate sign requests API for bootstrapping. So that is really important if you're a cluster admin and you want to, say, scale up your cluster dynamically. Then you need to have access to this particular authorization endpoint. Otherwise, when your cluster comes up, you have to manually go in and look at the certificate sign request, and that's like kind of a pain. And basically, when you start your kubelet, you can start the API server with -- authorization node. So there's not too much here that is for you if you're not a cluster admin. The next one will be for you if you are deploying applications and so on. So role-based access control is what it sounds like, role-based access. Before Kubernetes 1.6, there wasn't actually any RBAC, which was like anything could talk to anything. And then massive changes were taken into 1.6, and now we're up to the 1.20 release is going through at the moment. And we've come a long, long way, which is really, really good. But RBAC is something that I find when I speak to people, they're like a little bit confused about, and also it's a little bit clunky, the setup. And we're hoping that stuff like Open Policy Agent will be a little bit more straightforward, but only time will tell. The good thing about Kubernetes, though, is because it's extensible. If you don't like Open Policy Agent, there is another 3 or 4 applications or plugins for policy that are available to you as well. So it will be very similar to the way you have the CNI plugin. You might like Weave Networking, you might like Calico, you might like Flannel, and because it's extensible, you'll be able to use whichever policy engine you feel most comfortable with. But at the moment, we mostly use Open Policy Agent inside Azure. But from the point of the developer, role-based access control is what your application can talk to, and also from a user's perspective, it's what users can do on your cluster if you're a cluster admin. So you can see here, to start the Kube API server, you can start it with the authorization mode. Before, like, we could have had node instead of example, and then RBAC, and then other options, because Kube API server has many flags. So RBAC is split up into basically a couple of things. There's cluster role bindings that I'm not going to talk about in this particular talk because they're not really to do with authorization. They kind of was like more of an admin task to tie everything together. But there's two major things that you need to know when doing RBAC. There is the role and cluster role. Permissions are purely, there are no like deny additive. There's no deny rules. A role is always on a namespace. When you create a role, it has to belong to a namespace. Cluster roles can be cluster wide, so that's something to be wary of. Depending on how you set up your Kubernetes cluster, hopefully you're just not using the default namespace and dumping everything into that. You're using it as some sort of logical separation of duties, and therefore you can start to split up what can see what. A perfect example was from an authorization point of view. If you put everything in the default namespace and you make a secret and you deploy that secret out, everything in the default namespace, if you've got no RBAC, will be able to access that secret and mount that secret into their pod. That's probably not something that you want to do. So be wary of that when splitting up applications and namespaces. Yeah, we'll just go on to the next bit. So as I mentioned, by the difference between the two, the cluster role is non-namespace. So a cluster role can be across multiple namespaces, and it can also, but it can be across. It has to be namespaced or not. That's really confusing. So if it's not namespaced, it goes across all namespaces. If it is namespace, it goes across one. It can't be both. I hope that makes sense. It's like kind of tricky when you first get it. You can't apply it to. You have to apply it to all namespaces or one namespace. It can't be both. So this is why you would use a cluster resource for. So define permissions on namespace resources be granted within individual namespaces. Define permissions on namespace resources and be granted across all namespaces. So that's the two things I spoke about before. Define permissions on cluster scope resources. So if you again go back to looking at permissions and authorization with the CNI plugin, they'll start to create cluster roles for the networking plugin, and therefore the node will have access across all the network and bits and pieces like that. Yeah, so this is an example of a role. So I'll break this down a little bit for you so you get a little bit more on what the difference between the role and the cluster role is. So you can see here we've got the API version which is RBAC authorization KS v1. So you can see there that RBAC is now out of beta. It's in version 1, which is really good. You can see the client there is role, which we're looking at a role example, so that's good. You can see the namespace there is default. You can see the name of the role is pod reader, and you can see the API groups is all of them because it indicates the empty comma, but you can see the resources is only pods, and you can see we can only get, watch, and list. So if you were this particular user or you were assigned to this role, if you went to try to delete a pod, you would not be able to. If you tried to create a pod, you will not be able to. This particular role only allows you to look at the particular pods that are defined. And as you can see there, from a sysadmin background, the verbs bit might be a bit strange because it's not something you're used to, but if you're more of a developer, it makes perfect sense because it's just listing the API resources, the API types that are available to the particular role. As I said, I come from a sysadmin background, and it took me a while in my development. Once I started learning about APIs, then I was able to understand all this stuff. But If you come from a pure release sysadmin background, it's like kind of a little bit daunting when you first start to look at it. This is a cluster role example. So you can see here, again, it falls on the same API version. Oh, sorry, it does not. Oh, no, it does. What am I talking about? Sorry, it's a bit late here. It's 11:30 at night, so I'm a little bit tired. My first meeting this morning was at 6 a.m., so it's been a long day. But you can see here the kind is cluster role. So it's no longer a role. You can see we're talking to somebody else. You can see the namespace is omitted because it's not a cluster. It's not namespace. You can see here that we're going to create a secret reader. The API group's the same again, and you can see that the resources is only secrets. So this can pretty much just have a look at all the secrets that are there across the cluster. So you'd have to be careful who you assign this role to, because as I said, this is cluster role is not namespace. So if you assign it to an application and or a user, then they would be able to see all your secrets across all namespaces. And that probably isn't something you want to apply to everyone or everything. Also, the last bit of this that I haven't put in the slide is to tie this all together, you have to have a cluster role binding. I didn't quite put this in this talk because it wasn't much to do with authorization, more of a administration function to tie everything together than assign it. But all the authorization methods that you need to do inside Kubernetes to be able to access a resource are done with the roles. Cluster role binding just binds it all together and brings it alive. So webhooks. So as we spoke about, the webhook is actually really interesting because that's what the Kubernetes can look at to see if a user has certain privileges. An example of this would be Open Policy Agent. So you can talk to a third-party service and then or a policy engine and then see if you want Kubernetes to do something. Another one would be, as I spoke about, we've built the Azure Pod Identity. So if you want to talk to a third-party service within Azure from Kubernetes, and that could be something like Cosmos DB, and you don't want to mount secrets inside your pod or inside the secrets inside Kubernetes itself, you can then get an AD token from the pod identity, and then it will use that to talk to the service. And that's totally dynamic from your application itself. That would be an example of something third party that Kubernetes is determining if there is access or not. So as we said, there needs to be configuration, and I'll go through the little configuration. It might be a little bit small. I tried to break it up as minimally as I could, so please bear with me. And you can see that it's the webhook config there is some like your file name. The configuration file uses a kubectl format, and that's important to know when using the API of webhook. So hopefully you can see this. You can see the version of the API. You can see the kind is config, the name of the remote auth service, and you can see the cluster and the certificate authority. Hopefully, when you're building a third-party service for Kubernetes to talk to, you're looking at some sort of authorization via certificates and some sort of it's just not like an open API because that's not really good. And then you can see the user webhook configuration, and you can see the name of the API server, and then the client key and certificate. And then if kubectl needs one, then you can provide that there. Okay, cool. I made that for a 30-minute talk, so hopefully I've done that. I'll stop sharing so I can see if there's anything in the chat.
Hey, Scott.
Hey.
Would it be correct to say that webhook is like an external authentication, relies on external authentication provider, not authentication, but rather than authorization provider, in a way that's like an LDAP type of things outside of the cluster? Let me just simply ask the question differently. What's the use case of webhook?
What's the use case for webhook? So I'm trying to think of a good. So for example, Service Mesh uses it. So Istio. So if you have a look at Istio and you look at how Pilot talks to it, it actually uses webhook. So that would be a policy engine sitting outside of Kubernetes itself that uses webhook. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, in this case, it's when I was looking at the Istio's authorization policies, it is actually determines for example, your traffic flow from outside and inside, exactly based on the verb things that who gets what, right? So is this the same type of implementation?
Yes, because it's as you know, Istio come from Google and Kubernetes come from Google, and it's a very similar implementation of how authorization works. Istio's authorization model is like a lot more complex, though. So I think when Istio was envisioned with some of the policy and authorization model that they put inside it, they were envisioning that it could fill the hole that Kubernetes didn't have, but it doesn't suit every use case.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I've got another one, AKS RBAC versus Kubernetes RBAC. Which one would you recommend? They are exactly the same. Everything in AKS is from upstream. So one of the things we pride ourselves in AKS is we promote upstream Kubernetes and then backport it to Azure. Perfect example of this was we actually put Windows nodes in upstream Kubernetes before we had it in Azure. We did do all the work of that. We've got a team inside Azure Compute that is just working on upstream contributions, and then we've got a team that are working on AKS, so to backport that stuff to AKS. So you can, it's one and the same. We tried not to break away to Azure specific things that are not in upstream. If we use APIM in front of AKS, do we need a webhook? That would depend if the APIM is built to understand Kubernetes and if it's Kubernetes aware. So it needs to be Kubernetes aware, and then it can talk to the webhook interface. If it's not, then it'd be like you'd be building something yourself. I'm not sure if you want to do that. That would be something I definitely want my APM manufacturer doing, only because there's so much stuff going on in Kubernetes, like some stuff changes and anything else? Thank you for the intro. Oh no, that's people saying thank you.
Yeah.
But if you have anything, like if this was a little bit like of a beginner sort of introduction to authorization, or you want anything other Kubernetes stuff and you want something a bit more technical, let me know. I'll be more than happy to come back and we can do something like that.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting, Scott. In fact, we are sort of taking a break during Christmas and New Year period time. So I think we would look something to do around this in maybe Q1 next year.
Yep, definitely. Sign me up.
Yeah. So is there anybody else who would like to ask the question instead of typing it in the chat? Maybe we can use this opportunity.
I do have a question. I asked same question about RBAC. So Scott, what I have found is in AKS, if you go to IAM and see the RBAC roles that has been defined, so that is one thing, right? Second is you can define roles or cluster roles they are different. They are specific to Kubernetes, right?
Yep.
So which one? You recommend us to go? So should we write our YAML file for cluster roles or roles based on the namespace, or we should go just to IAM and see the roles there? There are 4 or 5 roles defined, which is other than cluster role, right? And use them on the.
Sorry, so you're talking about you're talking about the. That's not the. Sorry, that's just so I understand. That's not RBAC. What you're talking about is the policy Azure policy engine for Kubernetes, and because that is that what you're referring to? Like the 5 roles that we've got on the console that are already built for IAM. Yeah. So that's a new product we've got coming out. So that's actually running on a third-party policy engine. It's an open source project in CNCF called Open Policy Agent. The answer, I've got a really convoluted answer to your question. If you need something today and it's not there in like the Open Policy Agent or the Azure Kubernetes policy engine, then maybe start with RBAC because like you will need some sort of security controls. But watch that space because that product's going to grow and that will probably outdate it. RBAC, well, that's where we're hoping to go with it, I believe. But at the moment, that's only in preview. So if you need something like this production ready and stable and rock solid, use RBAC, like the RBAC I showed, the Kubernetes RBAC. But if you're looking for something a little bit more on the edge and that's in I think it's in public beta, then have a look at Azure Policy Engine. We'd definitely like to get people using it and have feedback on it. It's just you might not get exactly what you want without writing a custom policy, but you can actually ingest custom policy from Open Policy Agent if you write it yourself as well into the policy engine.
Sure. One more question I have. So the way we are right now using AKS, we have created single namespace with the name dev, and we are putting all application in a single dev environment, dev namespace. For QA, we are putting QA namespace and putting every application there. Do you see any security concern in this approach?
That's hard to answer without knowing your particular business. But I would say at a high level, possibly not, as long as you're not passing around production secrets. Or, for example, if a dev that's working on something in your dev environment could guess like what a secret is from the dev version of it. So like, for example, if they're working on application A and there's a dev team working on application B, and then you get some sort of disgruntled employee, he can start to like have a look at what secrets there are in application B, for example. And if you can kind of iterate through what that might be in production, that might be the security risk. But as long as your business is happy with that sort of everyone in dev can see everything in dev, then there's no security risk. But if you're doing something where you think that application A dev team needs to be a super secret source and application B dev team shouldn't know what application A is working on, it might be a new product, for example, then start to split stuff out. Because like, as I said, you can have a look at what's in that namespace. But yeah, I've seen plenty of businesses do it the same way. I've seen a lot of business do like a cluster for dev, a cluster for QA tests, and then a production cluster. So there's that's definitely not a wrong way to do it.
Sure.
It just depends on like the risk and what sort of data you've got there and stuff like that.
One last question. Sorry to ask so many questions.
One
last question is so in case of AKS, we use ingress controller, right, to send the data from outside world to AKS. Yep. So our ingress, for example, if you're going to use HTTPS, then we have to define a certificate as a secret in Kubernetes, and then we pass that secret in the YAML file to define the ingress controller or gateway, whatever you say, right?
Yep.
But the problem with that is, if I'm a cluster admin, I can always go and look into the secrets. It's just an encoded script, right?
Yep.
Is there any way? That not to get that secret from Kubernetes secret, then going back to keyboard and then grab it from there and use it?
Yeah, 100%. There's 100% you can use Key Vault for that. Yeah, because Kubernetes secrets aren't really that secret.
But what I have seen in the YAML file, you have to give the name of secret. How you are going to pass on that from Key Vault to the YAML file?
I'll get you a doc on how to do that, and I'll pass it on.
That would be great.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Scott.
No worries.
Scott, if you can add this into your slides, this instruction, I think a lot of people would be interested as well.
All right. What about I'll send it through to Nilesh, and then we can put it on the meetup page or something. Might be with the slides.
Yeah, you can send it to me, and I can share it with the rest of the people.
Yeah, I'll get that tomorrow morning my time. I've got one more question. Is there any way we can audit system events inside Kubernetes cluster pod level? When you define, I'm not sure who wrote this. I would be good if you can answer this for me. When you define system events, are you talking about system events within Kubernetes itself, or are you talking about system events inside your application? Because there's different ways to monitor it. There's a short answer, yes, you can do both. Some of the stuff that Sonia was speaking about earlier actually leads into that. So if you have a look at system level abnormalities, and that we've got that inside Azure monitoring, so you can start to look at and do audits over every event inside Kubernetes. On your application level, you'll need to have some sort of hook to do tracing, and then from there you will be able to hook, do your application metrics and get inside that as well. So the answer is yes, there is a way to do both. Just depends how far down you want to go to the inside the audit system. But yeah, there's definitely you can get metrics from both.
Okay. I don't see any other question on YouTube stream. So maybe one last question, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask before we close the session. Looks like no. So thanks, Scott, and thanks, Sonia, for taking time and doing these wonderful sessions. I hope that once everything goes back to normal, we would have opportunity to host you in person in future. For now, it's a lovely thing to have you guys present remotely. And I think in one way or the other, this COVID helped us to bring a lot of remote speakers, which might not have been possible if everything was going as normal. But I do hope that it ends so soon and we are back to normal. So thank you. Thanks for your time. And I hope that the rest of the attendees, you can join us next week and in future for the sessions that we have planned.
Yeah, definitely.
I know it's quite late in Australia, so have a good evening, good night. And for the rest of the people joining in Singapore, I hope you are getting ready for your dinner. Have a nice dinner. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone.
Yeah, bye. Stay safe. Bye-bye.